Thank you very much for this presentation, and I was really shocked with the powerful data you have shared with us. On the riots going up and civil war going down, was it calculated riots per event or per day? For example, if a riot was going on for a week, would you count that as one event, or you would count that as seven riots? That's one clarification, right?
That's a very good one. It's a while since I looked at the data set, so I can't remember exactly how they do it, but I'm pretty sure that, for example, a riot that lasted for 3 days, like the riots in Uganda, would count as one event. Whereas, if something was discontinuous, even if it was on the same issues, they would be counted separately. But it's not an exact science at all. And in terms of the conflict events associated with wars, again, they would be judged as, what is one battle and what can you separate. And I think it's a really important question. But if you go to because that's not my data, that's from it's called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database. They'll explain in more detail how they classify these things. It's a very interesting database.
I really think that Nigeria is one of the areas where, the events that's happening is being so much not very clear. And I would like to ask you one question on the elections. Yeah, I think this was the first time when we thought in Nigeria twice there was a transition between civil and civil, and now the next one is coming in February. Yeah. Do you think, and you mentioned a little bit how the gentleman agreement on North-South, and how would that be more threat than any other time? How the elections in February be affected? Would there be somebody who would completely chaotic, or you think still that democracy and that institution of ensuring that these elections will be as good as the ones before?
The thing is, the Electoral Commission has, if I can say it this way, it has improved significantly. I think there's a general agreement that some improvements have been made and some reforms have been instituted as well. Given the fact that some state-level elections were held, one was in August, I think another one was in July, so people are using that as a barometer to judge the next set of elections coming up. But having said that, again, there's really a lot happening in the country. So, for instance, there was actually a national conference that brought different interests and different people together to discuss the problems of the country and come up with solutions and things like that. So there are also, I think, if I can say, expectations that a new constitution might come out of that. And if a new constitution comes out of that, then, elections could even be shifted briefly and things like that. So it's really, really hard to say right now. But the Electoral Commission itself has seen a lot of improvements.
The idea is that violence challenges masculinities of the authority, be it the national authorities, the men, whether it's claiming the masculinity being challenged because the women are abducted, whether the masculinity is challenged because a man's attacked on the street but then tries to reclaim it through violence in the home. So I'm just wondering if there's some thing that we can tease out across the lessons that the three talks have given that might talk to that.
I think there are clear connections across all three presentations and subjects around this question of masculinity. I think in relation to South Africa, some very useful, it's quite old now, work by Cathy Campbell, who's a professor at the London School of Economics. She did some very influential work on cultures of violence and masculinity, and was tracing the ways in which those persist from the apartheid era and sort of the era of sort of political conflict and great disillusionment through to the current, well, the sort of post-apartheid era. And I think obviously there's, as Zainab has illustrated in Nigeria, there's ongoing trauma and frustration in South Africa with the way in which the political settlement has panned out, and huge persisting inequality, which obviously is fueling a lot of tension. I think we also have to be, however, have to be very careful about looking to political exclusion. Well, it's obviously inclusion now in South Africa, but looking to economic exclusion in particular as the only explanation to a lot of gender-based violence, because I think we also have seen an entrenchment in South Africa of patriarchal relations, and certainly Zuma has not helped South Africa in that regard in terms of its own practices. So I think we've seen an entrenchment of this notion that men and women are unequal and women are inferior. So in relation to gender violence, I think there's some other issues going on.
It's not something that I've thought about as much as I should in terms of the kind of urban protest events I was talking about, but they are extremely, extremely masculine, male-dominated, almost exclusively a lot of the time. These kinds of marketplace riots and the riots around the Uganda issue. So I mean, it's very much there. And if you go to Kiseka Market, for example, which is a marketplace in Kampala that had a lot of riots, and then also was actually one of the main flashpoints of the Uganda riots, and was blamed, was kind of stigmatized really as a place of violence within the city. It's an extremely masculine environment. It's one of the few markets where the vast majority of traders are men, because it's a mechanics place with car parts and so on. And it was quite interesting the way, actually, some later episodes of violence didn't unfold there, but it was almost blamed or associated with it. And so there are huge gendered aspects there.
When you talk about the themes and the various themes that are coming through in research on urban and civic violence, I was curious that all of you mentioned something about identity, belonging, and or some sort of thing about ethnicity, and I just wondered if that is a theme. Yeah, because many of the cities in Africa are experiencing a lot of migration, whether domestic or international, and you've got strangers, and I just wondered if is that a red herring? It's used obviously in some of the justifications of violence and some of the explanations. But do you think it's actually got a substantive role to play compared to the other things that you've been talking about?
I haven't come across that much commentary from my participants in all my projects around the relationship between international migrants and South Africans, although I know Kamna, who's in the room, has done some work on that. But it does come up occasionally, and largely in relation to jealousy, particularly jealousy of Nigerian male partners and Mozambican men taking South African women. So jealousy comes up, and that obviously leads to, that can easily lead to violence. I think for me the biggest migration issue that comes up all the time in my research is the ongoing tension between the urban and the rural, whether that's South African or foreign. And certainly the way in which men in particular talk about the rural with great affection, because it's a space where they see themselves as having much more control and power, where they see themselves as having privacy, dignity, authority, and that's often, in their opinion, lost in the urban sphere. So there is something specific about cities which men are struggling with as well. So for me, the migration question is largely around urban-rural rather than international, but it is, the international issue is also significant in South Africa.
I think in the northeast in particular, so Borno, Adamawa, no, I don't think Yobe, but Borno and Adamawa, they share a border with Cameroon. So there's a lot of influx, there's a lot of movement between Nigeria and Cameroon, and for that reason, you know, a number of people say that the insurgency has also been fueled by these cross-border movements, but I really can't say that much about it. That's not really my own focus of research.
Just increasing recognition that around half of the refugees in the world are in urban areas rather than camps, and they're extremely hard to identify. How it relates to questions of violence, I think, is also extremely complicated, and there are very, very different kinds of migration. I mean, whether it's international, whether it's conflict-driven, whether it's environment or climate-driven, and there's a lot of scaremongering around that. Migrants tend to be blamed for a lot of things. In my experience, in the cities, in this kind of violence I'm talking about, migrants haven't played a particularly central role. But that's not to say that they're not playing other roles elsewhere. And I would also just say on Uganda, in the north of the country, where there was a civil war with some interesting parallels with what Zainab was talking about in terms of the government's failure to address that conflict and possible manipulation of the conflict. There was a very interesting rural-urban dynamic that was also gendered and also related to migration, in the sense that Gulu in northern Uganda, which was a small town, became a massive city through the conflict. And the young men entering the city in many ways challenged the authority, the traditional role of the male elders. And there was something, other people have written about this, not myself, Adam Branch, I'm thinking of particularly, of a crisis of masculinity that was caused through that massive migration to the city that then also had knock-on effects on social violence. So these things are extremely complex and interact in all sorts of ways.
My question is more about Nigeria. You talked a lot about the more governmental institutional level and a bit about the perception of the communities, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the reaction of the communities after or during the violences. For example, one case I found is in Jos, where a few months ago there was bombing, and Jos had been quite a hot spot for inter-religious violence before that, and was at relative peace for a while. And so a bit whether the Boko Haram violence triggers or fuels more community violence, and whether the communities tend to go back to violence, especially between either Christians and Muslims, or maybe between different groups among Muslim communities, or whether there is some sort of resilience in those communities and they succeed in not going back into that trap.
So first of all, it's important to understand that Boko Haram targets anyone they classify as infidels or enemies. And these could be, a lot of times these are Christians, but a lot of times again these are even Muslim clerics. These are people attending school, and most of the time these are government officials or people working in the security apparatus. And why is this? This is because they are on a vengeful mission. They are still, quote unquote, angry about the murder of their leader and hundreds of their members in 2009 due to the crackdown by the government, the extrajudicial murder of the leader and the members. So they classify anyone falling into this category, government officials working for a state they don't even recognize its legitimacy, people in the security apparatus, Christians, anyone who opposes their own worldview is an enemy. So that's one thing. So secondly, there was a spike in the number of Christians, the number of churches they were attacking as a direct response to the conflict in Jos. So the conflict in Jos is both, it's ethnic, it's religious, it overlaps, to be very honest with you. But there's a lot of literature on that which points to conflict over land, over resources, some of the things Tom has mentioned, sorry. So regarding Jos itself, the recent bombings that happened there, I think just on that I would say the communities were very resilient, because even prior to that, they were making significant steps towards resolving some of their own local issues, their own local grievances. Obviously, there are times when conflict, violence erupts, but they have been making significant steps towards that. So at least in that community, in Jos, I don't think people interpreted it in those narrow regional terms or narrow religious terms. Boko Haram is just targeting Christians. People have started coming to terms with really what Boko Haram means, and that they really do not discriminate. Once they don't like you or they identify you as an infidel, they're going to attack you. So that is that.
Had it been the late president, Yar'Adua didn't pass on, are we going to have the insurgency we have today at this rate? Or possibly, had it been the 2011 elections was won by a northern Muslim candidate, are we going to have the same level of insurgency as we have today?
If the late president Umar Yar'Adua was still alive, whether the insurgency would have escalated or erupted. And again, for those of you who might be a bit confused here, what happened was that from 2007, Umar Musa Yar'Adua, a northerner, was elected as president. He succeeded a southern president, and he had Goodluck Jonathan as his deputy, but then he was ill and he passed away in 2010. And when he passed away in 2010, there was a bit of a succession crisis because some people in his inner circle felt the mantle of leadership would go to a southerner and the north would lose its turn, etc., etc. But what I want to say here is that even if he hadn't passed away, the insurgency would still probably would have followed this path. Why? Because he was the one who actually gave the instructions for the security I can't remember if it was the police or the military to actually use the words crush these people. And I remember one of the ministers, I think it was a minister of information, actually went on CNN and said, we're going to crush these people. So he gave those instructions, and if he was still alive, it would have still followed this path.
How does LGBT fall into all this gender-based violence? Like the gender perspectives that you've mentioned?
I'll say very honestly, there's very limited work on this in relation to questions of gender-based violence. In my own research, I've never come across a single participant who's disclosed a sexuality other than heterosexual, and I don't think that's because that doesn't exist. I think it's because people are too scared, too anxious to discuss that openly. I think I often come across people who say that South Africa's so liberal, so progressive, and you've got your gay village in Cape Town, and it must be great for people who are not heterosexual to live in that society. But I think the reality is across most of the country, as it is across many other parts of Africa, including urban spaces, that it's very difficult for gay and bisexual and trans individuals. And when it comes to questions of violence, I think that the police are particularly poor at responding to those kinds of issues effectively. So it's not an issue that I've ever come across in my own work, but I can imagine that it is a significant issue. Certainly statistically, globally, domestic violence between homosexual couples is on the rise, and there's evidence around that in countries where people are able to talk about it.
I was going to say in a part of the presentation I didn't really do on the paper, which is essentially a paper about how in Uganda specifically, and perhaps in semi-authoritarian type regimes across Africa more generally, playing politics with laws that you don't necessarily intend to implement is something that governments are quite inclined to do, because they have these legislative bodies that they need to somehow manipulate and manage. And the whole experience of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda, I think, reflects that to a great deal. So even though it wasn't a bill that was introduced by government, it was introduced by a private member, it became the object of politics, and it became something that the government used to benefit from politically, both domestically and internationally, over a period of about 4 years, right? So nobody believed in the start the government wanted to implement that bill, and in many ways it was constrained in terms of what it could do, but it was also using it for political ends. And in the process, and I think this is something that hasn't been much explored, there was a lot of violence and people died. There were, on this location, armed conflict location database, you'll see a number of protests specifically related to that bill and the debate on that bill, and they were violent and people were killed in them. So keeping a debate alive for a long time on this bill, which benefited the government, actually resulted in a lot of violence and will result in further violence. Anyway, so that's just, again, a point about how the manipulation of democracy can result in this kind of urban outcomes. Anyway.
The idea of gated communities and integrated cities is my interest, and what impact do you think sort of the apartheid of public access to communities and the lack of integration has as an effect on urban violence, and whether there's a relationship there potentially around poverty and access to services and territory within the city?
I don't work on gated communities at all, but I think it's a good question. I don't know that much about it, but I think obviously people working on gender violence look to gated communities with great skepticism and anxiety as being a space where domestic violence may be very well hidden from the public and from a response. It's very hard to get into those places to even access participants in the first place. The question of how gated communities impacts on urban violence is a really good question, and I think we just don't know. Clearly they reduce participation in cities, they reduce access. and I would imagine that they fuel inequality and tension between different residents. But some of the work that I've seen shows that many urban poor and lower middle class people are desperate to live in gated communities as well. So we've got to think about what types of spaces and why people want to live in those spaces. And I would argue that that's also relates to the failings of the justice system to deal with crime. And crime is a huge political issue. And I think people often see gated communities as an easy solution. So it's not just a wealthy response, although it often is that the wealthy are the only ones who can afford to live in those kinds of spaces. But we're seeing gated communities crop up all over African cities across the continent, so it's certainly a spreading phenomenon. I think it's a really interesting issue to keep an eye on.
Fortunately, there aren't too many gated communities yet in the countries where I've been doing research in Eastern Africa. But there's lots of interesting work on it, including people like Charlotte Domansky. But to me, in some ways, I mean, research is needed on this, and it's a bit of a sweeping statement. But gated communities and gang violence are almost two sides of the same coin, right? Because if you're going to take a space out of the arena of public space, out almost of the arena of a state-governed space, where it's kind of governed by alternative private norms and institutions, then the fact that other people will want to create spaces that are outside of state government is not surprising, or will want to claim spaces as their own, and that a lot of gang wars and turf warfare is effectively about that. And I don't think it's any coincidence that you see a high correlation between places with a lot of gated communities. I mean, obviously it's not just people making themselves safe from that violence, but it's also, I think, some research indicates a response to the very existence of gated communities. And I think there's also a broader issue that is interesting for research across all these issues around ungovernable space and making space ungovernable. There was something that Zainab said that reminded me of this. Often people have interests, and government have interests in spaces that are beyond state reach or somehow ungovernable. People benefit from that economically, politically, in various ways. And that's intimately linked to violence. And even the kinds of things I was talking about in relation to marketplaces, they would get to a point where the state just wouldn't go there. But at the same time, there was all sorts of politicking going on and political mobilization within this supposedly kind of space beyond the reach of the state. So I think there's all sorts of interesting issues.